Right, well, we'll get going again so that we can keep things moving along today. Our next moderator is Andrea Bowe. She is the Business Development Director and Communications Practice Leader at AE2S in Grand Forks. Andrea has over 20 years of marketing and communication experience and is the co-chair for the Northeast District of NDPC, Valley Marcom. Thanks for being here today, Andrea.
Thank you, Sadie. I am so excited to hear our next speaker tackle the topic of fake news, real consequences. I think this is a hot topic. Erin Hemi Frazali is an instructor in the English department at Concordia College, where she teaches journalism and advises the student newspaper. She started her career as a newspaper journalist, including nearly 12 years at the Forum. She has worked in marketing, serving as the editor of the college alumni magazine and weekly digital newsletters, and founded her own writing business, Whistle Editorial. So welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and it's so good to be with you all today. Fake news, as you mentioned, it's a hot topic today. And one place I'd like to start as we introduce this is that as much as the terminology fake news is new, it's also important for us to realize that fake news as a concept isn't new. If we look back in some history, you will find that there have been fake stories that have run. For example, in 1835, there was this wild story that ran in the New York Sun that documented life on the moon, and was a story that included unicorns and bat-like men, and these people flew, and people actually bought this paper and were kind of freaked out about it, and it was a hoax. And it was a way to sell papers. Does this sound familiar? Not that our current mainstream media are doing this, but I think we are basically seeing a continuation of some different things that have happened throughout history. And yet the digital communication environment we're in has kind of brought things to a new level. And so we know that what fake news is, but one of the things I'm going to ask us to think about is actually to drop the term fake news. Because I think we all have different understandings of it. And so for part of our discussion and for part of, for something for you to think about is what we're actually talking about is, in most cases, we're talking about disinformation and or misinformation. And every presentation needs a good Venn diagram. And so here's a way for us to think about information disorder is kind of the terminology that's thrown around in research circles. But as you'll see, we've got kind of this group of false information. And that's broken into two categories. One is unintentional mistakes. And so you're all communicators. If you've ever put the wrong date out there or spelled somebody's name wrong or accidentally flipped some numbers around, we've all done it. That's misinformation. You're not trying to mislead anybody. It's an accident, you correct it, you move on. We get into the circle of disinformation when somebody is actually deliberately manipulating content to be false. Now, they might have all sorts of reasons for doing this. For example, and we'll get into some different examples here, but satire isn't necessarily trying to harm anyone, we're trying to entertain. But when we try to harm someone, that's when I think it becomes problematic. And when I say harm, it means trying to lead someone to perhaps take some action on the information that you put out there. And we've seen that in a lot of different cases in recent history, everything from If you're familiar with Pizzagate that happened before the 2016 election, is one example of that, where a false story about children being jailed in the basement of this pizzeria in DC by Hillary Clinton. And then somebody actually came with a gun and tried to save the children. And it turns out there was no basement in the pizzeria. And so that's where we're starting to get into that malinformation and disinformation category. And so I think it's important for us to understand that there's a lot of different subcategories when we talk about this whole concept of fake news. And so as we break that down, I've just thought it would be helpful to look at, some different examples. And some of these are going to be more familiar to you than others, but I think you'll recognize all of them. But again, it's really beginning to understand, how do we label these? Because I think once we start labeling them, we have a deeper understanding of what's happening. And so we're all familiar with satire and parody. We all love The Onion. There's lots of other media platforms out there that share this. Bust a Troll is one. The Pelosi story about emptying Social Security to pay the national debt was actually one of the most shared stories on Facebook a couple years ago. And so these stories have traction. And while they aren't designed to be harmful, they certainly have the potential to fool. And because of that, we kind of just need to understand the role they play in what we share on things like Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all those things. Another form of misinformation, disinformation, is misleading content. And this is content that isn't necessarily false. So this is an example of, as you'll see here, we have a picture of Australia. And this ran when Australia had all these bushfires back, it feels like a long time ago, it was about a year ago. And the celebrity Rihanna shared this image, and she was using it as an example of how bad the bushfires were in Australia. The problem is, this image is actually a piece of art. And it is art that is made over 30 days of data from fires. And yet it looks like a satellite screenshot, right? And the problem here is, when people saw this, and Rihanna shared this with, I think, 96 million of her closest followers, as this example of how Australia was on fire. And what was happening in Australia was definitely serious. And there were fires in all these places, but not all at the same time. And so when we see this content, it's just really something we need to just watch out for. A third type of miscontent is imposter content. And I love this example because, for once, it's not just digital. And I think we have this view of that all fake news is because of the internet and how fast communications is working right now. And this is actually a paper that was handed out on May 1st, 2019. And they were handing it out at the train station in DC as people were getting off and going home and going to work. And as you can see, so the bottom paper is actually the real Washington Post, and the top paper is a fake Washington Post. And if you were handed this newspaper, I'm guessing you probably wouldn't look that carefully at it. And you can't really see it in this image, but one besides the story differences, one of the differences is the fake edition slogan reads "Democracy awakens in action" instead of "Democracy dies in darkness," which is the official slogan of the Washington Post. But it would take a pretty careful reader to see that. And so this paper was put out by a group, a trickster activist collective, as they call themselves. And they were just trying to make a point that it was time for President Trump to go, and passed along this fake news and this fake story. We also see this occasionally. You'll see fake websites put up underneath celebrity or politicians' names and things like that. So that's another place where we see that. Obviously, fabricated content is one of those areas we need to watch out for. And this is just content that is wrong. It's just flat out made up. And we saw a lot of this during the pandemic. We're still seeing a lot of it. We see a lot of this during the election. Why do people do this? It's a mix of bad actors. It's a mix of people just trying to get reactions. It's a mix of people trying to, in some cases, make money through clicks. But this is an example of, fake news fake news / fabricated content that was shared during the pandemic, that you couldn't actually get COVID if you had a runny nose. We know now that's not true. But you see this kind of information out there. False connections. Another way to think about this is clickbait, which we've all seen. And it's these images and these headlines that really try to get us to move to the content, which typically is very disappointing. In this case, the kids end up jumping in a pool that is for sale, which has nothing to do with this beautiful setting, like they're jumping off cliffs and we think they're jumping into a pool of alligators or something. But we see people using this as a way to, in a lot of cases, they're trying to get more clicks for things like ad dollars and things like that. A sixth form of fake news or misinformation is just false context. And this is information that is true and is accurate. It is just put in a misleading context. And so this is an example of a video and an image that was shared by President Trump. And he shared it at a time during the Black Lives Matter protests and things like that, and suggested that this was actually a member of Black Lives Matter or Antifa, and that it was an example of those protests. Well, it was actually happened nearly a year before that. It was someone who did something in the subway. This person was arrested and wasn't a protester. And so we need to keep an eye out for that type of content as well. And then one of my favorites is manipulated content, which we're seeing a lot more of as AI becomes a bigger factor in communications. We know that people can manipulate videos pretty easily. We saw this, there's a famous one out there with Obama saying some pretty awful things, and it's not actually him. We saw this with Speaker Pelosi had a video that went viral where it was slowed down, so it made her sound drunk. I'm not going to take time right now to run through this, but and maybe I'll send this out or put this in the chat later. But the New York Times did a piece on Design to Deceive and talks about how we now have the technology to basically create photos. So this actually isn't a real human being. This is an image of a made-up person, which has, on one hand, is great because we no longer have to ask people for permission to use their images in different situations, but it is problematic in that, you know, if I were a politician and I'm trying to convince you to vote for me, and I do a campaign of all these people saying wonderful things about me, and they end up all being made up people, I have some concerns, ethical concerns about that. And so I think this is one of those growing areas where we just need to be aware that this is happening and is actually pretty easy to, or I should say, is much easier to pull off now than it was a few years ago. And so you're going through all of this and you're probably wondering, yeah, okay, thanks, Erin, for sharing that, but I would 100% not believe any of that stuff is true. I'm a smart person. So how can people believe this stuff? And there are two trains of thought. And like most nuanced, complicated issues, I think there's a bit of truth to both. The first is that our reasoning gets hijacked. We're vulnerable to misinformation because, frankly, we think we're smarter than we are. We also, our brains are designed not to think really hard about everything. And so if you think about that, you know, you get up, you get dressed, you go grocery shopping without putting a lot of thought into it. And that actually lets us get through our days without putting a lot of energy. It becomes problematic when a lot of information is thrown at us. And so you kind of start hearing, these are some of those psychological terms, and this is a good reminder to tell you that I come at this from the perspective of a journalist, not necessarily a psychologist, but I think there's some really interesting things we can learn from psychology. And there's been actually quite a bit of research on these types of things. So heuristics is one of those where our brains actually have shortcuts. And that is one of those theories where, again, we don't want to think. We tend to believe what we want to believe. And so if we have a belief and we see some content that supports that, we're like, yeah, that's right. And we really don't dig into it any deeper. That would be confirmation bias. And then there's also pluralistic ignorance, which is basically where we don't always understand that others think and believe something different. And so, and these aren't the only types of reasoning things that affect us, but they're just examples of our brains are not designed to analyze and deal with complexity all the time. And that's a good thing. The second train of thinking is that basically we're lazy thinkers is a good reason why we believe this stuff. And to me, that actually rings true because of this whole idea of reasoning. And we're smart. We like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, but frankly, most of the time we're motivated by emotion and irrational thinking. We believe that what is familiar is true. And it's good and it's safe. And again, good reasons for that, but it becomes problematic when we start seeing misinformation or false news that keeps showing up over and over and over on our news feeds. So then that kind of brings us to this whole idea of what do we do? So we're not as smart as we think we are. Our brains are designed to take the easy way out, and we like what is familiar. We like what gets shared by our friends. We like these types of things. And so there's been a lot of good information shared by this group called the Stanford History Education Group. And it's run by a psychologist by the name of Sam Weinberg. And he's done numerous studies trying to figure out why are even the smartest among us so bad at making judgments on the internet? And how can we get better? And this was one of my favorite studies that they've done in recent years. So they took 3 expert groups, and they took some historians with PhDs, and they took some news fact checkers, and they took some undergraduate students. And they had them assess a lot of information online. And one of the specific pieces they did was they actually asked the group to assess some information about bullying. And there was some information there from, oh shoot. So the American Pediatric Association, there was some information from them, and then there was some information from a group that had actually splintered from them. And both groups had very professional looking websites. They had studies with citations, and so they watched historians, fact checkers, and undergraduates try to go back and forth and try to figure out what was some of the background of all these websites. And what they found are that fact checkers are actually the fastest and the best at assessing information, that they were very quickly able to determine which information came from the Association of Pediatrics and which came from their splinter organization, and what some of the biases might have been behind both of those pieces of information. And they were able to do it very quickly. Historians with PhDs were actually pretty awful at it, which is kind of surprising. And undergraduates weren't a whole lot better than the historians. So what can we learn from this? I think there's a few things. One, when you are online and dealing with digital information, always second guess your instinctual reaction. Remember that we are emotional people. And so if you see something that makes you go, or makes you angry, or makes you want to applaud, just stop. Take a step back and ask yourself if it actually is true. Practice a skill called reading laterally. And this is something I think as communicators, we're actually pretty good at. And you know, your kids or your grandkids might actually know it as the crap test. You know, sorry for that word, but I think it's true. It's a way for us to get beyond the BS factor. And what does crap stand for? It means reading content for currency. Is it, you know, when was it published? Is it something that's recent or is it old? Is it relevant? Is it something you actually need to know? Who's the author? Authority. Who's the author and publisher? What is their background? Accuracy. Is it reliable and true? And finally, purpose. Why does this information exist? And I think when we actually stop and think about that, it will actually keep us from doing things like sharing false information or perhaps using it in a story or in some other communications that we have. The other thing I think we need to learn to do is to practice reverse image searches. I don't know how many of you actually do this on a regular basis, but we all know that digital communications relies very heavily on photos and video. And so learning to use if you're actually, or learning to understand if you're actually looking at an original piece of information is important. And you can look at, so Google has a good reverse search. There's also a phone app called TinEye that is really easy to use where you can just upload photos and actually get a bit of history on them. And it's actually quite interesting to find that there's a lot of photos out there used in multiple different situations, and we just need to be better at figuring out how to do that. So I know that is a lot of fast and furious information, but I think we're probably pretty close to the question time, Andrea.
Yes, we have about 5 minutes left for questions if anybody has any. I don't think I see any popping up on chat just yet. I found that really fascinating, Erin. Thank you for that. I always appreciate the insight when it comes to the psychology of why we do things the way we do it. So thank you for that. It looks like we have a couple questions coming in. The first one is, what was the reverse image search app?
TINEYE. TINEYE.
Okay, thank you, Erin. We have a couple more questions here. Do you see it more challenging with citizen journalists in the mix?
The short answer is yes, and yet they're not going to go away. And so, yes, I think it is more challenging, but I think as professionals, our job is to treat citizen journalists just like we do any other source, in that you have to vet them, you have to figure out their background and their purpose. I mean, we've recently seen citizen journalists do some pretty amazing work and provide some amazing insight. George Floyd, the death of George Floyd is an example of that. And yet, you still need to ask questions and not always trust from the beginning, just like you would any other source. It's a great question.
Thank you, Erin. It looks like we've posted a link to the app in the chat if people are interested in that. I don't see any more questions popping up, so it looks like we'll have maybe a couple minutes to wrap this up and get ready for our next session. So thank you, Erin, so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.